Welcome. Hi, everyone. I'm really glad you're here and looking forward to talking about special education advocacy, 10 tips for advocating for your child. I'm Rachel Nemhauser. I'm the Director of Information and Family Support at the ARC of King County, and we'll be leading the presentation today. Ramona.
Hey, yeah, so I'm Ramona Hattendorf. I'm the director of, what am I the director of? Public Policy and Civic Engagement. It never rolls off my tongue. Here at the ARC of King County. And I just want to talk a little bit about what this program is today. We do a lot of trainings, and this is a training we often do, but this particular version of the training we're doing specifically for the Inclusionary Practices Technical Network. And there's a link here, and I will be sharing these slides out. But this is a statewide effort. It's run by OSBI. There's also a group called West Ed that they've contracted with, and there are community partners across the state. And most of them are school districts or somehow, or maybe an ESD, they're educational districts, but they also include what's called the Family Engagement Collaborative, and we're part of that. We're part of the FEC. It also includes PAVE, it includes Roots of Inclusion, and Education Northwest. So this and other programs we're doing will be posted on our website. They will also be posted on the Family Engagement Collaborative website, so we can access them throughout the spring. Feel free to sign up for any and all. What I do is if you register, I will send you a link. If it's already passed, I will send you a link to the materials and a link to the actual recording. So even if the date's gone, you can still watch them. And we've got several. This particular one is about aimed towards families for navigating schools. We also have ones that are aimed towards educators for insights on supporting families. And we have a series for both people. We were thinking more educators, but I noticed in our first one, we had a number of family folk come as well. And that's understanding disability. And that's just kind of unpacking it, learning a little about disability, the models of disability, things like that. So welcome. And it's back to you, Rachel.
You want to share a little bit about I'll do this part. Okay. So we are here from the ARC of King County. We're a nonprofit. We're located currently in Renton, Washington, which is part of King County, soon to be moving to SeaTac area of King County. We promote and protect the rights of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, or what we refer to as IDD, so that we could all live, learn, work, and play in the community. We are driven by the fundamental belief that everyone deserves to write their own life story, including real access to education, meaningful employment, quality health care, and genuine community connections. So at our chapter, we have a wide variety of ways that we do that, including information and family support, systems navigation, education, and civic engagement support. We also happen to run a supported living program for adults with IDD. We are here to help or refer you to the best person for help on any topics related to intellectual and developmental disabilities. One of the most common questions we get is from parents about special education. And that's what we're here to talk about today. So I'm really looking forward to diving into that with you. And we have our contact information here and really hope that you will reach out to us afterwards if you have follow-up questions or if there's something in your life we can help you with. We're specifically here to support King County, but we love to try to help anyone who calls us as much as we can. So before we get started, I would love to know who's here today. If you're comfortable just in the chat sharing your name and what role you play, like are you a parent, are you professional, are you an advocate, a self-advocate? Thank you. Ramona has a poll up. Ooh. I think I just voted. Nope. kind of embarrassing to have it be recorded while I try to figure out technology. I'll just move. It looks like two parents at least in the audience, which is great. And this presentation was written for parents, although I think it's a really valuable presentation for the professionals who work with them too, because like we said, this is what parents are worrying about. This is what parents want support around. So if you're a professional that works with parents, it's so great for you to take some time to learn this. I think I want to take a moment and just introduce myself because I didn't do that yet, really. Like I said, I'm Rachel. I work at the ARC of King County. I've worked here, I'm going to have my 10-year anniversary in about 2 weeks. So I've been here for a while now. And I've been working most of that time. I've worked directly and intensively with parents raising kids with developmental disabilities. I also happen to be the parent of a 20-year-old son who's autistic and has been receiving special education services since he was 3 years old and aged into the school system. This has not been an easy journey to be his special ed advocate because I started knowing next to nothing about how special ed works or what my role was in that, and would say that I didn't really come to understand that at all, understand it in any useful way until I started working at the ARC when my son was in middle school. And since then, we've developed a really robust program at the ARC of King County where we're here to support parents who are helping their kids navigate who are helping their kids and advocating for their kids through special ed. And in the 7 or 8 years since we've done that, I've talked to hundreds, if not thousands, of families about their special ed experiences. So this presentation is built based on my personal experiences as a parent and also just the stories and experiences I've shared with families over the years. I put together a list of what I think is helpful to know as a parent, because gosh, I spent a lot of years not knowing enough to really be able to effectively advocate like I wanted to. So with that said, here's what we're going to cover today, assuming we have time, which I've done this presentation enough times that I can get the timing down. I'm not too worried about that. We're going to talk about the legal basics of special education. I'm not going to dive too deep, but we'll give an overview. We're going to talk about what is an IEP, what is an IEP compared to a 504 plan. We're going to then talk about evaluations and the IEP process. The highlight, we're going to talk about data. Just kidding. I don't know. I'm not a numbers person, but data actually plays a really big role in special ed. So we're going to talk about that. Inclusion and placement decisions, challenging behaviors, the advocacy hierarchy, options for dispute resolution, conflict resolution. And if we have time at the end, we can talk a bit about working with the IEP team. That's a whole separate presentation, really. And actually, I think we might have that scheduled later in the spring, but we'll talk briefly about that. Okay. If there is something you're hoping that I'm going to talk about today that I didn't list here, please feel free to throw that into the chat. I'll try to work it in if I can, or we can talk offline about it. Okay, let's jump in. Like I said, let's start with understanding the legal basics. The law is so dense and so complicated that I think for most of us, it might be out of reach to really master that. So I really am of the belief that if you understand the spirit of the law, it can get you pretty far in your advocacy. So with that in mind, I'm going to share the spirit of a couple of the laws that really guide the services we get. I guess I should say a caveat. A lot of these very laws are in the news right now and may or may not be impacted by our current federal administration. These could change. I hate to say that, but this is not how things stand right now. First law, Section 504. It's Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 extends civil rights to students with disabilities. It allows for reasonable accommodations as necessary for each student for them to be able to access their education. So Section 504 guarantees access to education. We're going to talk a lot more about what that means over the course of the presentation, but you can picture a student with a wheelchair needing a ramp to get into the building, or a student who's autistic might need other more, maybe more complicated accommodations so they can learn. That's Section 504. The other law is the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act, IDEA. It's a federal law that guarantees a free and appropriate public education. You've probably heard of FAPE, free and appropriate public education. That comes through the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act. We know our kids are entitled to a free education. We understand the concept of public school. Appropriate can sometimes get a little blurry. Appropriate is a rather vague word that can leave room for a lot of debate, but the law requires a free and appropriate public education for students who are eligible, and we're going to talk a lot about eligibility. And last, but definitely not least, the federal law requires that a student learn in their least restrictive environment. So according to IDEA, and in accordance with the rules around getting a free and appropriate public education, least restrictive environment means that a student is educated in general education and is removed from general education as little as possible by providing specially designed instruction and all the supports they need with their gen ed peers. Now we're going to deep dive into a lot of this as we go on, so don't feel like you have to grasp that right now. But the real takeaway that I think is so critical and can really make a difference as you're advocating is to keep in mind that every child has a right to an education. They have a right to learn and to make progress on their learning, and they have a right to all the things they need around them in order to access that learning. And they have a right to receive that learning in their neighborhood school around their general education peers to the maximum extent possible. And I really like to reiterate that when I'm working with families. As the parents of a kid who has sometimes made it hard for made his teachers work hard, let's say. Sometimes it's not easy to stand up for his rights. But so I really like the reminder that he has a right to be there. He has a right to learn, even if he makes it difficult for them. And he has a right to access the accommodations he needs to learn. What are your questions about that? Okay. Oh, I saw someone come off mute.
Oh, no, you're good. Go ahead.
Okay. I meant to say this earlier. Especially because we have a small crowd here, I am very open for comments and questions throughout. So also, I'm open that you might be feeding your kids in the background and can't engage like that. So whatever way you're comfortable, but please be comfortable sharing any questions that come up as we go. That wasn't just to you, Allison, that was to everyone. Okay, then let's move on. Next thing, know what an IEP is. And this is pretty basic. I'm assuming most people who are here know what an IEP is, but not everybody does. And I think it's an important thing to remember when we're working with families that we're all starting, most of us are starting from a very entry level into the world of special ed. So what is an IEP? An IEP, Individualized Education Plan, is a legally binding contract that lays out the special ed instruction, supports, services a student needs to thrive at school. And I once said this to a group and the person said, well, I don't sign any contracts without my lawyer present. So why would I sign this contract? Well, the difference is this isn't binding you as a parent to do anything. It's a contract from the school about what they promise they're going to do. A parent is an equal member of the IEP team. So the IEP is created by a team in which you as the parent are an equal voice. You're not a more important voice than anyone else. You're not the lead of the team. I've heard some parents think that that might be the case, but you're an equal member of that team with a right to request a meeting or or express a concern at any time. All IEPs look different. We're all live, people are watching this throughout the state. I go to IEP meetings in districts throughout King County, and they all look different, but they all include the following. All IEPs are going to include present levels of performance, like data that shows where our student is right now in their skills and what they can do. It's also going to include annual goals, where we want them to be a year from now, where we expect them to be a year from now. It's going to include special education and related services, including supplementary aids and services. We're going to talk a lot about that. So don't worry if that sounds like a lot of gibberish, but basically all the things we're going to give them to support their learning. Accommodations, how much school day the child will be educated away from their non-disabled peers, and how often those services will be provided, like how many minutes of math, how many minutes of social emotional learning, and who and where that learning will take place. And I listed these all out because what I think is good to know is that every one of these are up for discussion. They're all part of the conversation that takes place among an IEP team. So want to make sure everybody keeps that in mind. Any questions about what is an IEP? Okay, that's an easy one. I know it gets more complicated. I'm often asked, what's an IEP? Do I want an IEP? Do I want a 504 plan? How do I know? And this presentation is really about IEPs and special ed, but let's talk for a minute about what is a 504 plan and how do you know which one of these you want? An IEP is going to include modifications to the curriculum. It's going to change what the student is learning. And it's also going to have accommodations, changing the things around how the student learns. So if you remember going back a few slides, an IEP is going to have what we need, what IDEA requires, and also what Section 504 requires. On the other hand, a 504 is just going to have the accommodations. So you would never have both. You're either going to have an IEP or a 504 plan. For students who have tested and are eligible for an IEP, and we're going to talk a lot about that in the next slide, they're going to receive special education services through their IEP with accommodations described in that document for how they're going to learn. The IEP is going to have goals in it and is going to be really focused on how are we going to accomplish those goals. A 504 plan does not have goals. It just has the things the student needs to learn better. When a 504 plan is created, there's no real belief or intention that these might be temporary. A student who's blind is going to always need access to Braille. There's no assumption that they will one day grow out of that. They might sometimes, but with an IEP, the goal is moving forward and making progress, when a 504 plan is a little different. One thing to note is that if your student has an IEP, that means they have modifications to their curriculum. That means they're learning in some ways something different than their peers. That can take a student off a graduation track, off of the standard graduation track. All students graduate at the end, but it might and result in them. Oh, sorry, we just had Ramona, maybe keep an eye on we had some people join. Sorry. Okay, train of thought. If you modify the curriculum in certain ways, it could take you off the track that gives you a diploma that makes you eligible for college. So if you have a student who has an IEP and you have plans for them to attend college after high school, this is an important thing to talk about with your IEP team or with the school counselor. But that's just a little aside. We're here today to talk about IEPs. So for the rest of this time, that's mostly what we're going to be talking about. But before I move on, are there questions about IEPs or 504 plans, what they are, how they're different from each other?
Hey, Rachel.
Yeah.
This is Ramona. So I just have a comment because sometimes people don't know the difference. And I have a son and a daughter. They're all grown up now. One had an IEP and one had a 504 plan. And they're very specific. The IEP was really about services. This child needed speech language therapy. And so the IEP was very specific around those services that they needed. The other child did not have an IEP. They had a 504 plan. And that came actually for them, it came a little bit later in middle school, high school. And that one was really specifically on what sort of accommodations did they need to really to be able to access learning. So for them, it was things like some additional time for testing. It was things like preferences. It was things like, it was a plan, like if they got overwhelmed and it was an elopement situation. Like they got overwhelmed and they were going to run. Like who was the safe person in the school what they would go to? So it was things that they needed to be safe in school and to learn in school, but there weren't any services that were
It didn't
provided.
change what they were learning in any way.
No, it
That's
didn't.
right.
It didn't bring in any services. It didn't adapt the curriculum in any way. So those were just kind of the difference. One is it's just about like what makes it easier for you to be here and be present and really get your education. And the other one was, okay, what do we need to do differently for you uniquely so you can actually, learn and thrive and access it.
That's right. That's right. And something that I think is interesting to note, this is how I understand it. Schools secure their funding for special education services by proving that their students on IEPs are making progress. So IEPs, I've heard described as having teeth. They're really heavily monitored for a lot of reasons. There's a lot of laws and regulations in place. And also the school is heavily invested in your kid meeting their goals. A 504 plan, on the other hand, there's no one's tracking it. No one's measuring it. No one's really poking their head around to say, are you doing these accommodations? So they don't tend to have as much teeth. They don't tend to have as much weight behind them. And they're sometimes, unfortunately, not used the way they should be. So any other questions or comments about that, about IEPs and 504 plans? Okay. So let's move on. Let's talk about the whole process, along with evaluations and how you even get into special ed in the first place. I honestly think my son was on an IEP for 7 years before I understood this cycle, which is amazing because if for anyone here who's had a kid on an IEP for a long time, you do this cycle and you do kind of get used to it. They call me every February and say I have to come to a meeting, but I didn't really understand how it all works. So let's just run through how it actually works. Special ed is always going to start with a referral. In my son's case, the referral came from his early intervention provider. He was approaching age 3. He was going to age out of his ESIP program, and he still needed help. He was still behind. So they made a referral to our local school district. A referral can also come from parents. It can come from a professional. It can come from a 4th grade teacher. It can come from anyone who has a vested interest in this student and has reason to be concerned. I would always recommend that referral, and actually any other special ed communication ever for the rest of your life should be in writing if possible. So I would always recommend that referral start with in writing, an email to the student's teacher, to the school counselor, to the principal or vice principal, better yet, all of those people, telling them that you have concerns about the learning of this student. I encourage you to be brief, but be very specific. My concerns are in math, reading, writing, and his speech development, if you can. If you don't know what your specific concerns are, you can explain it more. It's okay. Your voice is really needed here. The school as a team is going to decide whether your student whether they have reason enough to be concerned that they're going to do a special ed evaluation. They want that, and that can be tricky. If there are people here who are in that specific situation where you're having trouble getting the school to agree to an evaluation, first of all, you have my sympathy, because that's hard. I see that play out, and that's really difficult. But I have a whole strategy we can talk about for that. But essentially, you really want to be able to demonstrate how their learning is really being impacted. Saying something kind of vague, like they're just not happy, while that's worrisome, and if it were my kid, I'd be very worried about that, the school doesn't see that as necessarily an actionable problem, and unfortunately. So to be as specific as you can about what your concerns are. But for the sake of this conversation, assuming a referral for special ed comes in, the next step is the team is going to decide what to evaluate. And at this point, they're going to spend some time deciding what to evaluate. My understanding is that they're usually going to do math, reading, writing. But if you have specific concerns in one of those, you should request it. There's also other areas they could evaluate in: speech, OT, occupational therapy, physical therapy, vision therapy, social, emotional, adaptive, behavioral. These are all areas they can evaluate in. And I like to list those out because if they don't evaluate you and your student in a specific area, they won't be able to provide services in that area. So for example, if they don't evaluate in social emotional, they can't do any provide help in that area. So it's important to be really specific and thoughtful when you're working with the team to decide what they're going to evaluate in. So then they're going to go do the evaluation. In some cases, if your kid's a 3-year-old and they're home with you, it will be you bringing them to the school, or the evaluator maybe joining them at their daycare to do some evaluations, asking parents to fill out some forms. If your student is already at school, most of it will take place while they're at school over about the course of a month. And I want to make a side note. I said about a course of a month. There are actual guidelines about how many days. And personally, I don't spend a lot of time memorizing those days and focusing too much on them, because in my experience, that's one thing they do stick with. If they go out of their dates, like if they only have 30 days and they take longer than that, that's when their funding comes into jeopardy. So my experience is you don't have to worry much about that. They'll worry about that. But they're going to spend about a month doing the evaluations. And then they're going to call everybody back for a meeting. All the evaluators, the teacher, the school psychologist, you as mom and dad, anyone you want to bring with you to the meeting will come together to hear the results of the evaluation. This can be a really important meeting. There's not much as a parent that you have to do. I have parents ask me, how do I prepare for that meeting? My advice is just go ready to listen and ask a lot of questions. This is when they are going to tell you everything they learned about your kid through these evaluations. So they're going to tell you a few things. First of all, did they score low enough to qualify for special education services? We talked earlier about the law protects qualifying students. This is how we find out who qualifies to be for special ed and who qualifies to be protected by that law, is through these evaluations. So I think it's something like if they are 2.5 standard deviations below normal in any given area, they qualify for IEP goals and services in that area. So say they do this battery of evaluations and they find, well, she is behind in math, but not reading or writing, and she's struggling with social emotional, but not speech, OT, or PT. You would end up with an IEP that's just in math and social emotional without the other stuff. And that would be at that point, the team would decide, yes, we're going to go forward and create an IEP. But there's other things you also gain from that meeting. Those evaluations have a lot of information about your student. My hope is that they're going to spend that time focusing on their strengths, what, the things we learned about them, about where they excel, and then also the challenges that the evaluations show us. As a caveat, as an aside, if you disagree with the results of the evaluation, if they come back to you and say, actually, she's fine in math, like, I don't think she doesn't qualify, she's a little behind, but she's doing her best, and I think she's doing okay, and you disagree and you think, no, she needs special ed services in math, you have a right to request what's called an independent educational evaluation. So you have a right to ask the school to pay for an evaluation by an outside third party. It's completed by a professional who has no relation to the school except for that the school pays for it. If they do that evaluation and it says, yes, she does need math, look how behind she is in math, you then can bring that report back to your IEP team. The IEP team is required to take that report into consideration, but they're not required to do what it says. So I like to just make sure families know that. It could be a very frustrating experience. You spend 2 or 3 months going out and getting a new evaluation, you get the results you want. They don't necessarily listen to you, but you do have the right to do that, and sometimes it does help. But assuming there are no major disagreements, the team will say she qualifies in these areas, she doesn't qualify in these areas. It's time to write the IEP. This is where the team theoretically comes together and uses everything we know about the student, everything we've learned about the student through their evaluations, through our time with them, through our observations of them, and uses all of that to build this legal document we talked about earlier that explains everything we're going to do for this student and all the accommodations we're going to make for them. How it usually works, anyone who's ever been at an IEP meeting can attest to this. How it usually works is they give you what they say is a draft. And other than them saying it's a draft, and it might say draft at the top, it looks exactly like an IEP. It looks like it's kind of pre-written. And then you spend the IEP meeting going through it and seeing if you have any questions about it. This is not my ideal way of doing things because it's not the collaborative building of a document that I would like to see. So my advice is, as you're leading up to an IEP meeting, either your first one ever or just your annual, in the days leading up to the IEP meeting, I encourage you to reach out to the team and ask for a draft of the IEP. They're probably not going to be able to give it to you until much more than 2 to 4 days in advance. And I think it's usually because they're just not finished with it until then. And they're not required by law to give it to you ahead of time, but they're required by law to try to give it to you ahead of time. If you are a person who, like, English isn't your first language, or maybe you have a disability that makes reading hard for you, and you need extra time, I would be sure to express that. Because when you get the draft of the IEP, you could then spend the time you have reading it through and marking it up, putting question marks next to the things you don't get, crossing out the things you hate, adding the things you wish were in there, so that when you come to the IEP meeting, you're a little bit more able to participate in the meeting. Those meetings go so fast, and if most of the time is spent reviewing a document that you don't understand or can't make sense of, it's not a really good use of the time. So I really encourage you to try to spend time ahead of time reviewing it. And that's the kind of thing we can help with, as could, I would assume there's resources local in other counties. I would hope so. But back to the cycle. The team comes together. They're going to look at this IEP. This is your time. This is when your voice matters. And I'm going to say a caveat for that. I can't tell you how many times I was told, and still am told, your voice matters. We really need your voice. Except I had no education or knowledge to back up my voice. Like, I know my kid really well, but I didn't know how special ed works, didn't know very much about disabled people or about how disabled people learn, or about how my specific son learned. Like, teaching him things was actually really hard, and I needed other people to tell me how to do it. So I really want you to know as a parent that your voice matters, but I also really want you to know that it's okay to lean on the expertise of the team around you too. Like, my hope is that you have a speech therapist there who really knows how to incorporate, speech support throughout the day, and that's built into the IEP. I hope that the special ed teacher knows how to include them in a general education classroom in a meaningful way, et cetera, et cetera. So it's okay. I guess my point is, I don't want you sitting there feeling like you're failing your kid or letting your kid down because you don't know enough how this works. The hope is that you have a team and you're all doing it together. What you do know about your kid will help tremendously. The way they respond to things, his experiences they've had, the way behaviors you see at home, all really matter in that conversation, even if you don't know how special ed works. So let's say, for the sake of this conversation, you have this conversation, and after an hour or two, everybody agrees to what's in there. You will be asked to sign a document, and actually you'll be asked to sign a document whether you agree or disagree. That document is only for attendance. It only shows you are at the meeting. It doesn't mean you agree. And a frustrating side note is the school does not need your agreement. They don't need your approval or permission. Other than the first ever IEP. They just need to show that they included you in the conversation. If you disagree and they say, well, we're doing it anyway, which can happen sometimes, we're going to talk about what to do. And that's going to come up a little bit later. But for this conversation, let's go on the assumption that you all agree. And I know that sounds crazy, but I have been there many, many times. It can happen. Most IEP meetings are not major contentious fights. Most are very pleasant and supportive. So we all agree the next step is implementing the IEP. Everything that's in there within a few days needs to start being provided. That means if the IEP has 20 minutes a day of speech services, that needs to start happening. 20 minutes a day of speech services. We're working on those goals. If it says that they need a wiggle cushion for their chairs to help with their proprioceptive blah, 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 that wiggle cushion needs to be there. That starts and goes on, that implementation. Starting right away, there should be a collection of data. There should be data collection going on. And we're going to talk more about data on the next slide, but there's an important part of the cycle that's here, that we don't just implement the IEP and then check in a year later. We implement the IEP and track very closely to make sure it's a good IEP. Every 3 years, that we're required to do those evaluations again. You can do them as frequently as once a year. So if a year has gone by and you think the evaluation results are no longer accurate, you can request a reevaluation, but they have to do it every 3 years. Every 1 year, they're going to rewrite the IEP. So they're going to call you into a meeting and they're going to start the whole thing over. Sometimes it's moving a goal. If they didn't quite meet the goal, we're going to reword it. Sometimes it's creating all brand new goals. I usually hope for that. I don't want to see the same goals moved ahead year after year. With periodic check-ins throughout the year to make sure that the IEP is still effective. That's the cycle. We're going to dive deeper into the data and progress report section of that. But I want to make sure everybody's clear on how this all works. And I want to just give a little bit more information about evaluations, make sure I covered everything. Let me look through my notes on this slide. Yeah, one thing I wanted to say, that the threshold for eligibility for special ed is adverse educational impact. Your student might have a disability that impacts them in other ways, but doesn't impact them at school or impact them in their education. So having a disability in and of itself doesn't make them automatically eligible for an IEP. Their disability has to have an adverse educational impact. I've seen this be a challenging area for families because sometimes as the parent, we think or see that this is impacting our students, and the school may not see that. I see that especially for kids who get okay grades, or for kids who like are really quiet and don't cause behavior problems, that the school will be like, it's fine, everything's fine. And the parents like, no, but they're suffering inside, you just don't know. And that's having an impact. These can be difficult things to hash out with the team, but that's the threshold you're going for, is adverse educational impact. Okay, I think I covered everything else. What are your questions about this whole process and this whole cycle? Is there anything that surprised you on here? When I'm teaching this and I ask for questions and no one asks questions, I always say, either I'm so clear that you have no questions, or this is so confusing that you don't even know where to start. And one time I said that and someone said, it's that, it's the so I mean, I hope it's not that, but please, if you are confused or if I'm losing you, feel free to jump out with a question anytime.
Rachel, this is Courtney. I
Yeah,
have
hi, Courtney.
a comment and question. I usually send the team a parent input form about a week or 10 days before the IEP meeting with the goals that I want and the accommodations and supports, and basically like my first draft of the
I love that.
IEP.
Yeah.
And then a lot of it gets, not a lot, it depends on what I put in there, but some of it does go into the draft IEP. I was wondering how you feel about the service matrix with the minutes being filled in the draft.
Oh, okay. First of all, I want to say I really love how you said that you basically send your own draft. Love it. When I do another presentation that's like preparing for the IEP meeting, that I get more into details on that. But I love telling parents in preparation of any meeting to send their own agenda ahead of time. Like, here are the things I plan to talk about at the meeting. And I think this is kind of the same idea. Don't wait for them to tell you what they want. If you know what you want, and if you know what you think your student needs and what's best for them, ask for it. There's always a negotiation that's going to take place, but I love that level of assertiveness. So in terms of the matrix, honestly, I've never seen it any other way, where other than that the matrix is already filled out in anticipation of the meeting. I would love to see it blank. I would love to see the whole thing blank and we all build it together. Honestly, like, I think the fact that it's done the way it's done, where they show up with a mostly completed document, is a very alienating part of the process for parents, because it looks like the work has already been done and the decisions have already been made. And I always really like to tell parents, this is a suggestion. It's a starting point.
My daughter's IEP meeting a month ago, I actually requested that the service matrix be left blank and that we discuss the whole thing in the meeting. And it was probably the best IEP meeting that I had attended as a parent.
I love that. I think that's so great. I that's going to give me a lot to think about because
Because I just
that's
wonder
how
if
it
they
should be.
fill in the matrix ahead of time. I mean, could that be predetermination of placement?
Good question. Yeah. I mean, it would mean a lot of schools are out of compliance. If that's the case, but I think you're right. I think you're raising a really good point because the way it should be done, just if it's not clear, is we should write a goal and then we should think about how much time does this student need to meet that goal. It shouldn't just be like all kids get 20 minutes of math a week. It really should be about like the goal and the setting and the student and their learning needs and their learning pace that determines those minutes. So I think you're right. Any other questions or comments about this? Is there a sample template available for families to use to request an evaluation? You don't need any kind of template. I don't know of a sample template. I think an email that just says I'd like to request an evaluation in the, in this, if you could be specific about what you want them to evaluate, I think that's all you need. Is there something more that you're looking for than that?
Sorry, this is Jennifer. Yeah, I'll add
yeah,
on.
go ahead,
That
Jennifer.
question. I was thinking like more like, I think earlier you mentioned how like families should be like specific on exactly what they want the school to evaluate in. And so I was thinking like, do you think it would be sometimes families they might, because of what I've heard from families I work with, like sometimes they might not even know what they should be evaluating their child on. And so like, would it be better for them to like keep it like as general as possible? Like, is it possible for schools to evaluate all areas if they're unsure?
Yeah, I mean, I would think that all areas thing is not done because like they're not going to do vision if you don't have a student who's vision impaired or that kind of thing. But I don't know, there must be a list online of like the areas so I guess that would be available for families. But what I usually say to families is assuming they don't have that kind of list. Oh, thank you, Courtney, is that I just encourage them to be specific about what their concerns are. So they don't have to know the terminology.
Got it.
But if they say, I'm really concerned about his ability to express himself, or I'm really a bit worried about he doesn't seem to have friends and he can't relate to his peers, that should be enough for the person to know social emotional. But that would be my hope. Because so I just kind of go in the assumption most parents don't have that, always have access to the right verbiage. Wow, there's really good resources being shared. Oh, and thank you for sharing. Ramona is putting in the chat a webinar about rethinking how evaluations are done. I mean, I think we all know that like the way our students are evaluated at school, especially our students maybe who have more severe disabilities or more intellectual disabilities, we know that they're not being accurately measured. We know that they're not being viewed from a strength-based perspective. So really appreciate that. Okay.
Hey, Rachel?
Yeah.
So this is slightly off, but I just, for the record, for people who are watching later, it didn't come up as a question, but sometimes I hear from people like, do I have a right to record the IEP?
Mm.
And and right now, there's people who want to have that legal right. Right now, we don't have the right to record it. You do have the right to request a recording, and some people need that for their own accessibility. And so you certainly have a right if you have an accessibility need towards that. So I just wanted to clarify that you do have the right to ask for it, make your case. Hopefully they'll agree. If they disagree, then maybe you have to get a little bit more strong about what your case is. But especially if it's your own access, they have to, yeah, I mean, they have to follow basic ADA requirements. ADA is Americans with Disability Act. So if you have a disability and you need that access, then yes, you should definitely ask for it and make sure you get it.
I'm so glad you brought that up. It's an important reminder. Those laws at the beginning, section 504 also applies to the parents. So like Ramona's saying, if you yourself have a disability, you have a right to the same accommodations to access your students' learning. That could play out like being being allowed to have a recording of the meeting. It could be asking for large print documentation. It could be asking for extra long meetings to allow extra time to process, that kind of thing. So let's move on to everyone's favorite topic, data. And actually, this concept that schools speak the language of data was a real perspective shift moment for me. This is what I didn't understand until I started working at the ARC, that IEPs should be and usually are created based on data, and changes are made based on data. The minutes assigned should be made based on data. And I, as Nate's mom, do not think in terms of data. I think in terms of like what I know about him and what he needs and where he struggles and how much I love him and all of that. So I wasn't really thinking at all about data sitting in those meetings, but the school was. And that can cause a lot of that can lead to a lot of almost miscommunication or misunderstanding, because they're talking about data and I most decidedly am not. So let's talk about what I mean when I'm saying all of this about data. Assessment data, to start, like we talked about on the last slide, should be used to assist the IEP team in problem solving, goal setting, and creating the specially designed instruction. In addition, any changes we make to the IEP should be informed with data. And this could go in each direction, a change the school wants to make or a change you want to make. So I'm going to share an example. When my son started high school, he had a rough transition. The first few weeks were difficult, and they were seeing behaviors from him that he hadn't seen in middle school. And so they weren't accounted for in his IEP. And the teacher contacted me and said, I want to update his IEP to add a one-on-one para to manage his behavior. And I said, well, I don't really want to do that, because we used to have a one-on-one, we've moved away from that, and that feels like it's going backward. And the teacher said to me, well, it's actually not your decision. It's an IEP team decision. So I'm going to go ahead and collect data for a month, and then we'll come together as a team and decide whether the data shows he needs a one-on-one, which I didn't love being told it's not your decision, but okay, fair enough. I can accept that. So that's what she did. She spent a month, she collected data. In that case, I think what she did was keep track of the minutes each day that he needed the attention of a staff person one-on-one, and then added it up and said, does this qualify as needing a one-on-one? And as it turned out, over the course of that month, he settled into his new school and the behaviors went down and he no longer needed the para. And I really like sharing that story for a number of reasons. That was the right way to do it. She did it right. It's a good illustration of that changes should be informed with data. It also is a good example of slowing down the decision-making process. Sometimes we want to speed it up. Sometimes things go very slow, but sometimes they'll just call you and be like, I want to make this change. And you're like, wait, what, who, how? It's all happening so fast. And asking them, what data are you using to make that change, inform that change, can really just force them to have to slow down and either collect that data or provide you with that data. The same can be in the opposite. If you are requesting a change, you're encouraged to request that change with supporting data. So here's an example. My son needed a para support on the bus. He was having lots of behavioral challenges on the bus, but I was having trouble convincing the school that that was the case. But he was doing things like running up and down the aisles or taking his clothes off, or at one point he got a bloody nose and didn't manage that very well. And he was just clearly needing support. So what I did was I started keeping very close track of every date, everything that happened, the way it was responded to, the way it handled. I took photos when I needed to. And after about a week, I was able to send an email with a whole lot of data explaining my position that he needed more support, and then they were able to provide the parent. That is one kind of data you can provide. Another way you can provide data is quarterly progress reports. You, as the parent, should expect to receive a quarterly progress report throughout the year. It should come around the same time as the report cards would come or do come. And it is going to give you an update on every single goal in their IEP. So some IEPs only have 1 or 2 goals. Some have a lot more than that. But each one, it's going to tell you, like, data-wise, how they're doing. When we wrote this goal, you could only put your jacket on independently 1 out of 10 times, and our goal is that by the end, he'll put his jacket on 9 out of 10 times. The progress report right now is that we're at 3 out of 10 times. So you as the parent, that could be a really powerful tool for you. You might say, well, it's been 9 months and we're not even close to that goal of putting his jacket on independently. He still could only do it 3 times. I think he needs more specially designed instruction to learn that goal. So you might call the team and say, I looked at the progress report. I noticed he's not making any progress on that jacket goal. And right now he only has 15 minutes a week to work on it. I would like to propose we add another 10 minutes a week working on that to make sure he reaches that goal. So that's another example of how you might use data to implement change in the IEP. If you are sitting here thinking, I have never received a quarterly progress report, I have no idea what you're talking about, I hear that periodically, and you should be. And I encourage you to talk to your team if you're not. I also think sometimes, in my kids' case, they were sent home like smushed at the bottom of a backpack with a banana on it or whatever, and I didn't know what it even was. But that's what it is. Something to keep in mind is that IEP goals are written in such a way, or should be written in such a way, that collecting data to monitor their progress is doable. So most of the time, IEP goals are written in the SMART goal format. It's specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and time-bound. So I would hope you would never see a goal that says something like, will improve at appropriate interaction with their peers. Because first of all, we don't know what improve means. We don't know where they started, and we don't know where we want them to be. We also don't know what appropriate interactions with their peers is. In some communities, waving and making eye contact is appropriate. In some cultures, it's not. We also don't know where are we talking about, because waving and saying hello in the middle of math class is not really appropriate, but waving and saying hello at recess is. So a good IEP goal is going to be written in a way that makes it very specific and measurable. And this can be frustrating because you're like, well, yes, I want him to get better at greeting a peer and looking in their eyes on the field at recess, but that's so specific. And what I really want is much broader, like comfort interacting socially with their peers in the world. But the IEP is not going to write a goal like that. They're going to write a very specific goal. Last thing to think about with data is that data on current goals should be collected frequently and should be available to parents upon request. A trained eye can walk into a special ed classroom and see, or any classroom with a special ed student learning, and see data being collected. You might see a para with a little notebook and a pencil making tick marks. How many times I had to remind you to put your jacket on before you put it on, or how many minutes it took for you to settle down after recess, or whatever the goal is. This can be a really helpful tool. So oftentimes I'll get a call from parents that will say, well, we wrote this IEP back in October. It has like 12 goals in it, and I haven't heard word one about any of it. I don't know what they're working on. I don't see any improvement. I don't know what's going on at school. How do I figure out what's going on at school? One way to figure it out is to ask for the data they've collected on the goal. And they should be able to provide that to you. If they're not able to provide that to you, they're out of compliance with the law. It doesn't mean, first of all, that they're collecting data on every goal every day. That's not to be expected, but they should have some pretty current data. I also will just say, like, we don't want to take advantage, we don't want to oppress our teachers by asking for this all the time, because it's a lot for them to have to, they have a lot to do. But it's a good tool when you're worrying that they're not working on a goal or you're not seeing improvement on a goal. So that's just something to keep in mind. What are your questions about this? Or what is this? What are you thinking with all of this about data? Ramona, do you have any comments or any thoughts to add?
I don't on this one, other than, yeah, it's important. And it's important you have some sort of concept of why they're collecting it and how they can use it. It really also feeds into that when people go into what's appropriate. Well, that's often when data comes into, gets pulled in. It's like research what we know about what might be effective, what the law is. I mean, those certainly play into what is appropriate, but everything has to be individualized. It's an IEP, individualized. So that's where the data comes in. That's where they're trying to figure out, well, what's individualized about this.
That's right. That's true. That's a good point. That's how they prove that they're not just making general decisions. Yeah. One other thing, what was I had a thought in it. Oh, I know. One other thing to keep in mind, I just want to go back to these progress reports we talked about and the progress on goals. If you are a parent who's wanting more for your kid, more minutes, wanting a paraeducator, wanting to add something to their IEP, the first place I recommend starting is looking at the progress on their goals. If they are making progress on their goals, like at the pace you'd expect, if they're meeting their goals, it's going to be a hard sell to get more. And that could be frustrating because the way a parent would respond to that is, well, but they set really goals that were way too easy, or they're flubbing their data and the goals, it's not really accurately representing. But those are things to keep in mind at the next IEP when you start writing more challenging goals, maybe. But for now, to keep in mind, if they're doing well, it's going to be a tougher sell. On the other hand, if they're not meeting any of their goals, if they're barely making progress, and if you look back and they haven't made progress in years, you have a lot of power in that situation because they're not allowed to not make progress. They're not allowed to write goals and have your kids fail to meet them year after year. That's against the rules. And if that's what's happening, they have to do something. So that's when you really have some good bargaining power on your side. Okay. Let's talk about placement. I talked earlier about the right to receive your education in your least restrictive environment. First thing to know, inclusive education is a legally supported and evidence-based best practice that shows improved outcomes for all students. That's what the data shows. The way it's supposed to work, schools are required, the state is required to provide a continuum of care. They're required to provide education services in a variety of increasingly restrictive environments. All students should theoretically start off as gen ed students, and we should do everything we can to support them and meet their needs so they can be successful in their gen ed classroom. That's what the law says. Then, if we do everything possible, if we throw support at them, if we bring in the experts, if we modify the classroom, if we do everything we can think of, and they're still not meeting their goals and they're not making progress in their learning, then it would be time to consider as an IEP team moving them to a more restrictive environment to learn. I can't speak for anyone in the audience. That's not how it worked for me. When my son came into kindergarten, they told me the best place for him to be is a self-contained program. So he never had that opportunity for us to see how he could do there. It was just decided ahead of time. I eventually pushed back and got him into gen ed, but that's not how many students find the system works. A lot of students, especially those with higher impact, are sort of just funneled right past gen ed and into these more restrictive environments. But like I said, the law requires students to be placed in their least restrictive environment. Your student has a right to learn in their gen ed classroom until it's been shown that they can't learn in that classroom. And the same holds true for attending their neighborhood school. My son was the expectation, and for a year he was bused across town to a school outside of our neighborhood where we didn't know anyone, which was not what was best for him. Keep in mind that educational needs are going to drive the IEP goals, and the IEP goals are going to drive placement. After the IEP is written, we're going to decide as a team. Now we see what his goals are and what his challenges are and his needs are. Where do we think he's most likely to learn? And if we don't have any other information, the assumption is in the gen ed classroom. There are a few ways I want to point out that we should not determine placement. We're not going to determine placement prior to the team agreeing on an IEP. I found this frustrating when I wanted to fight the district. They wanted to put him in this program. I wanted him in this program. And I sat at a meeting really raring for a fight. But first I had to sit through an hour-long IEP meeting. And then at the very end was the time to talk about placement. So I'm just warning parents that they're going to make you wait till the end of the meeting to discuss that. You're not going to determine placement based on their diagnosis, anything in any IEP category or any labels. So we're not going to say, well, all kids with autism go in this classroom, or kids who are medically fragile should all be in this medically fragile program. We're going to determine where a student should be based on that student and not based on just a general diagnosis. We're not going to choose placement based on academic performance or like the severity of their disability or the needed modifications. We're not going to say he has such high needs that he has to be in this other classroom. No matter how high the needs are, he has a right to be in his least restrictive environment, even if that means some pretty significant accommodations to the classroom. And even if it means that that student is learning very different things than the other students in the classroom. We're not going to determine placement based on lack of resources or how hard it would be to coordinate and schedule. I've heard that. I heard that for myself, for my own son, and I hear it in other meetings. It's too expensive. We can't afford that. The staffing he needs is in this classroom, and we can't bring that staffing into that classroom. All sorts of nonsense like that. None of that is in the law. We're also not going to choose placement based on we've always done it this way. I hear that this is how we always do it, and this is how kids do great. This is where they thrive. None of that. We're going to make the decisions of placement based on where they are most likely to learn and make progress on their IEP goals. What are your questions about that? If you are a parent who has a strong opinion on where your student should, what kind of placement or what kind of classroom they should be in, I encourage you to think about the previous slide about data, because that's how this decision should be made. More than anything else, I was very worried about my son being in gen ed because he was a noisy kid. He made a lot of vocal outbursts, and he ran around a lot and could be a little destructive. It turns out none of that was an issue. He got the right support. He had the right peers around him, and he did not do that stuff in that classroom. It's really easy to look at a kid and think, oh, that will never work. But they have a right to be there, and they have a right to try. And and use the data to show, well, he's not being successful in the self-contained program. He's not making the progress we want. Let's move him here, or vice versa. Any thoughts or questions about this? Ramona, I know you have a lot to say about this topic.
Well, I do a whole class
Yeah.
on basically inclusive and LRA. The one thing I always like to frame it for people is that, so there's 3 federal laws, and we've talked about Section 504, and we've talked about the IDEA. And we also have something called the Americans with Disability Act, and specifically there's Title II, which is about state and local programs that they can't discriminate. So IDEA is basically a grant law, so schools get money to do services, and in return they have to follow the laws. And so this is all about IDEA. But even if they didn't have this, or in addition to this, schools also cannot discriminate based on disability. And so that's where Section 504, which is way bigger than the 504 plan, that's something that anywhere that gets federal funding, they have to follow this law. And the ADA, and they both are basically about this, schools have to give an equal opportunity to benefit. I mean, all your public services do, but fundamentally.
And we're not into separate but equal. We're into equal.
Yeah. All these laws say integrated to the maximum extent appropriate. Integrated to the maximum extent appropriated. And then, but they really always try to emphasize it's an equal opportunity to benefit. So some of the things like if the placement, and if they are in a different placement, they aren't in the gen ed, it's like, well, how are they getting access to general education curriculum? How are they getting access to all these other things? Because they have a right to that. Like even with or without IDEA in mind, they have a right to the education opportunities that all students have. They have a right to access the program that all students have. So that's just something I like to remind people. It's not just about the ins and outs of IDEA. And what I've discovered is that school districts might understand special education and IDEA rules. Sometimes they're not really clued in to what the ADA has to say, the Americans with Disability Act has to say. So I always like to remind people.
That's such a good reminder. I should update my slide at the beginning. That's a good one to include. So we had a question in the chat. What are examples of different accommodations and resources that could be added to the classroom to support children who need it? Great question. And I think it's an unlimited list. I couldn't even begin to scratch the surface. I will give a few ideas, but I think Google and recently ChatGPT are great sources for ideas. So accommodations could be something like if you have a student who's hard of hearing, you might have a gen ed teacher who's wearing an amplification device around their neck. That's one example. It could be if you have a kid, so like my kid who likes to move around a lot, an accommodation is they have permission to move around a lot at the back of the classroom. As long as they're not disrupting or destroying anything, they can get their wiggles out when they need to. An accommodation could be a one-on-one para who's in there with them. My student needed that to stay safe and to stay on task. Otherwise, he would have never been able to do that. So it could range from things that are very small and very inexpensive or low impact on the school, all the way up to something like a full-time employed staff person there at all times. What can be frustrating is that a school is never going to give you a menu. They're not going to give you a list of accommodations and say, well, just tell us which things on here you want us to do. So I've sat in my own meetings, like Ramona, I have a son who's also has a 504 plan. And I remember them saying, well, what accommodations do you want? And I was like, well, what do you have? And they were like, well, what do you want? And I didn't even know where to start in that conversation. Google can be great. Like I have a 4th grader who has a lot of trouble sitting still in school and has ADHD and autism. What accommodations would you recommend to support him sitting still in school? And it will come up with some good ones. ChatGPT or Google. You're saying the school are the ones who are supposed to give you options?
Yeah, instead of asking you what you want, like they're the professionals.
So here's what they would say to that.
Yeah, oh my
Here's
God.
the pushback they would give on that, because I've pushed on that. They want to avoid being prescriptive. They want to avoid looking like they're trying to say all kids with ADHD need X by giving you ideas. So they say this is the way for if for anyone here who has a kid who's a DDA client, it's the exact same thing. When they'll ask you what services you want, but they won't tell you what services there are. And it's the same thing. They don't want to be prescriptive. And I pushed back and said, that is wrong. You're doing it wrong. You should tell us we need ideas. We don't know these things. They won't really do that, has been my experience. So they will propose ideas, but I encourage you to come with ideas for yourself. And I encourage you to ask for the moon. Like, all they could do is say no. But I have seen them have to build restrooms in classrooms. I've seen them have to build. I had a parent call once because her student kept jumping the fence at recess and running away. And this was a preschooler. And mom was calling me to say, how do I get her switched to a different school where she can't jump the fence? And I was like, no. That's her school. They need to provide a fence that keeps her safe. And sure enough, they did. They built a fence. What fence is low enough that a preschooler can hop it, right? Like, it was obviously not an adequate fence. So they are required to do some pretty significant things sometimes. Does that help answer the question? Oops. Sonia, did that answer your question?
Yes, thank you so much.
Okay. I know it gets much more complicated when we're talking about, I oversimplified. When we're talking about kids with really complex learning needs, these can be really hard conversations to have. You know, and my son was in a neurotypical 5th grade gen ed class. He couldn't read, he couldn't write, he can not speak. So finding a way for him to learn in that setting is complicated and requires expertise and requires a lot of collaboration. So those accommodations are going to get very nuanced and very, sometimes a lot of them. But I've also been told, don't do too many, because otherwise they'll never follow all of them. All right, we're running out of time. I want to make sure we get through the rest of this. Behavior. Speaking of behavior, we know behavior is communication. If you have a student who's misbehaving, first of all, remember, they have a right to be there. They have a right to learn. Challenging behavior does not mitigate either of those rights, with a few limits. Like if they bring a weapon to school, or if they're like putting the safety of other staff and children at risk, it could change. But for the most part, they're entitled to be there and they're entitled to learn. If you have a student whose behavior is interfering with their learning, my advice is to request a functional behavior assessment. That's an evaluation like any other evaluation, where they do a deep dive into the why. Why is your student behaving the way they are? What is the function of their behavior? We know that every time they go to music, they get really wild and out of control and run out of the classroom. Why is that? Well, maybe the FBA will show us that it's too loud in the music classroom, or there's a buzz in the lights and they can't tolerate it. A functional behavior assessment is going to try to dig in. Then they're going to use what we learn about your student to make some hypotheses. Well, we know that music class is really loud and it makes her lash out and run away. So what if in the behavior plan, we make it that we always provide her with noise canceling headphones before she goes to music class? So the behavior plan is going to have that, provide headphones for music. And just like the IEP, we're going to track that with data and see whether that's an effective strategy. If it's not, we're going to come back to the table and keep trying other strategies. The behavior plan is a document that would be like stapled right to the back of the IEP, and every staff person who comes in contact with your student would have this behavior plan. So if you're a parent who's getting the phone call, the dreaded phone call every day or every few days or even every few weeks, like he's having a rough day, can you come pick him up? You do not have to go pick him up unless it's those little rare instances that I'm telling you that I said, like a weapon or something like that. But in most cases, well, I guess what I would do when I get that call, if it's unusual and I haven't gotten that call before, I'd probably go pick him up and assume it was a bad day. If it happens a second time, I'm going to be requesting a meeting with the team as urgently as possible. And I'm probably not going to pick him up the second time, or at least I'll pick him up, but say, okay, I'm going to pick him up, but we got to have a meeting. Uh-oh, hold on. Okay, just messed up my screen. Oh, there we go. Sorry. And at that point, I'd want to be requesting a functional behavior assessment. If we already have one and I'm still getting the come pick him up phone calls, I'd want to be updating that behavior plan as quickly as possible because it's clearly not working. I would want to give a new plan 3 or 4 weeks to see if it's starting to work. Not that the problem would be gone, but that we'd see the data would show an improvement. But if a month has gone by and it's not improving, it's time for another meeting. I also would really caution or urge you to not get into an agreement where he goes to less school than other kids. I see that so often. Well, he just needs to come home at lunchtime because he's so tired and the school can't handle him. I mean, you know your kid, you know their health. And if that's what they need, then that's what they need. But the school is not allowed to do that unless it's you as the parent driving it. Like the school is required to teach him all day, even if he makes it hard. And just one last thing, students with disabilities cannot be suspended for behavior that is a result of their disability. Sometimes that's very obvious. Sometimes it's not so obvious whether the behavior was caused by the disability. Like, for example, if a student, my son, has kind of almost like a tic, he gives the teacher the finger quite often. He uses the wrong finger, so it's not quite as offensive. But either way, he's given them the finger. But we know that his autism makes it that he struggles with impulsive behavior and he struggles with communication. And those are goals we're working on. So he doesn't get suspended for doing that. A neurotypical kid might get suspended for regularly flipping off their teacher. If there's question, like, well, we don't know if it's disability that's causing him to do that, or that's just, his behavior. They would do something called a manifestation determination, which is a hearing that decides whether it was his behavior or his, or otherwise, or his disability, I mean. If a child is suspended for more than 10 non-consecutive days, they may be entitled to compensatory services, meaning like they're missing a whole bunch of IEP services when they're not at school and they're entitled to get those services back. This is just a helpful tool for you, for your advocacy. Follow the hierarchy. Start at the bottom of the hierarchy and work your way up. If you start up at the superintendent, and I'm telling you, I see it all the time, they're going to just kick you back down to the bottom. You kind of have to work your way up that chain. Okay. This is a list. This is a lot of text and it's very small, but I wanted to make sure you had this. The state Office of the Superintendent of Public Instruction gives you options for dispute resolution. Like I said earlier, if you and the IEP team cannot agree about something, you have options. You have the option to request a facilitated IEP meeting. There's a free option. It's a neutral third party that comes in and leads the meeting. And that could be for something like, if you're a person who just feels like you're not being heard at meetings or your voice isn't being included, they're not listening to you, all going too fast and you don't have a say in things, a facilitator can help with that. You also have the option for a mediator, the same, it's free, it's a neutral third party. And if you and the team have reached an impasse, you want gen ed, they want a self-contained program, no one's willing to budge, a mediator could come in and help you work through that. and I'm going through these very quickly because of time. There's a lot more information available online about how you do this kind of thing, or we can help with it. You also have the right to file a community complaint. It's a very easy form you fill out, or you can even just write an email explaining why something that your assertion that something on the IEP was not provided or that they're not being provided failed. You file that complaint with both your school district and the state, and both do separate investigations. And depending on the findings, you will possibly get compensatory services. Yeah, you have a right to request a due process hearing. That's basically a lawsuit. At that point, you are encouraged to get a lawyer if you can. I have a whole presentation I'm going to do later in this series on dispute resolution, and we'll talk more about all of these in depth, but the challenges around due process. I think it could be expensive, and you're not likely to win, unfortunately. You're more likely to win with a lawyer than you are without, but you're either way pretty unlikely to win. And then you also have a right to file, like Ramona said, we have rights as disabled people, and you have a right to file a complaint if your civil rights have been impacted. I thought we'd have time for this. Of course, I kind of ran out of time, but I encourage you as in your advocacy to be really thoughtful about your work with the IEP team. Think about what you want from that relationship. Balance relationship with advocacy. Like, being friends is great with the team until there's a conflict or until something goes wrong. Then it can be really hard if they're your friends. Being in a strictly business kind of relationship can bring some tension that makes it hard to work through, challenges that might come up. I hear some parents say, I want to bring cookies to the meeting because I think the teachers must be hungry and because it makes the room smell good and puts everyone in a good mood. And other people say, I don't have time for cookies. Like, can we just do our job and get in there and get it done? I don't have a right or wrong answer. We will talk about this in another presentation, but just think about it and be thoughtful. Being emotional is okay. Losing control is not okay. Crying in meetings, getting angry at a meeting, those are all expressing frustration, totally fine. But I've been in a meeting, I was in a meeting recently where the parents started dropping some F-bombs. The parent was there because they were justifiably upset with something that had happened. And I think if the parent hadn't lost control, they would have found they got what they wanted. But they were so upset and they lost control of themselves, and that stopped the meeting. As soon as the F-bomb started, the school team canceled the meeting. And then she had to spend the next few weeks going on some sort of like apology tour where she had to apologize to everyone, and which she owed them that apology, but it set everybody back. We were no longer talking about the problem. We were now talking about mom's behavior. So I encourage you to not let that happen whenever possible. Here are some additional resources for you. These slides will be available to anyone who wants them. And these are links for your information. Here's my contact information. And before you go, please let us know what you thought of the presentation. Ramona, I assume that means you're putting a link in the chat.
Yes, I'm so sorry. I lost my, I was so enraptured.
Right?
Yeah, there's a poll version of this, but I'm just going to do the Survey Monkey. If you could click through, that would really be helpful. It is something they ask us to do. And
it helps us improve and,
yeah.
and secure funding for additional.
Yeah, and it's a super quick survey. It's basic, yeah, it's super quick, just a few questions. That would be
I went through this quick, but here's my contact information again, if anyone needs it.
Yeah.
Let me stop sharing.
And I'm going to stop the recording.